All right. Thank you very much, JD. And I am absolutely delighted to be here. I was sharing with JD before I got on that this is a little bit outside my comfort zone. I haven't done a talk on Christianity in quite a while, although occasionally somebody will ask me what my motivation is for having founded GFI and the work that I'm doing. And so that always takes me back to Matthew 25 and the works of mercy and my Catholicism. So it comes up a little bit, but not in a long time in any depth. But I'm super excited to be here. Can people see the presentation? Excellent. So for me, I think the challenge of what it means to have a life worth living was reasonably summed up by Socrates, who said the unexamined life is not worth living. And it's worth remembering that the vast majority of people, including the vast majority of Christians, don't challenge ourselves to lead examined lives. Most people sort of do what's next without asking the fundamental questions around how we can do the most good. So Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living like 2,500 years ago, roughly. And kind of all philosophical comment, all philosophy since then has been commentary on this concept. One of my favorite quotes in the Bible comes from just a little bit before Socrates, which is Micah, roughly 2800, I think, BCE, written about the same time that Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. And Micah declared, "What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God," which is kind of the same thing as the unexamined life is not worth living, because I think most people...
Sorry about that. If we could all just go on mute if we're not already, but thank you so much.
Most people, we don't challenge ourselves to actually think about what it means to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. So I grew up in Oklahoma, and for my first...
Oklahoma.
I grew up in Oklahoma and was going through my ELCA confirmation class in 1982 when I was about 13 years old. And this is ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And we had a progressive pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Norman, Oklahoma. And for confirmation class, we put on a skit. And the skit was focused on Matthew 25, this passage. Matthew 25, which, as everybody on this call knows, is the one time in the Christian scriptures where Jesus talks about what salvation means. And in Matthew 25, Jesus basically declares that what salvation means is that you cast your lot with the people he calls the least of these. So did you house the hungry, feed the naked, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick and imprisoned? And it's not about what we say we believe, but it's about how we actually lead our lives. In the Gospel of John, the Gospel said, Jesus says, what it means that you believe in me is that you do the works that I do, which is to say to cast our lot with the oppressed, to cast our lot with the poor. So up until I was about 12, not sure what I would have said I wanted to be with my life, but that confirmation class and that passage and the study that we did through confirmation had an incredible impact on sort of who I wanted to be in the world. That was also about the same time that images were coming out of Ethiopia of starving children, and our pastor really did connect the dots. He was teaching us about homelessness in America. He was teaching us about global poverty. At that point, it was north of 1 billion people living in extreme poverty. And he was really challenging us to think about what we could do as Christians and what our obligation was in terms of the Micah passage. What does it mean to act justly in a world where 1 billion people are in nutritional deficit, which is a euphemism. Of course, they're actually starving to death. At that point, it was 60 million people, none of them in the United States, dying from starvation-related causes. what does it mean to love mercy? What does it mean to walk humbly in a world like that? And it had a huge impact on me. And I got into what I thought was what he thought and what I think I thought was probably the thing that would be most impactful, and that was politics. So I got very, very political in Norman, Oklahoma, and I was introducing my local congressperson, David McCurdy, and campaigning for him. And I was president of Cleveland County Young Democrats my junior and senior years of college, and was driving David Boren and Dave McCurdy, my congressperson, and my senator, who was not the Republican Don Nichols, around. And basically, my goal was to use politics in this Judeo-Christian nation to solve the problem of global hunger. And I got to college, and at the school that I went, everybody showed up a week early to figure out what you wanted to do and make sure you didn't get lost trying to get to your classes, and figure out what the groups were that you wanted to be active in. And I joined a group called Poverty Action Now, which was focused on organizing fasts for Oxfam International, and volunteering in a local soup kitchen. I went to a small liberal arts school in Iowa called Grinnell College. We volunteered in a soup kitchen in Des Moines, organized fasts for Oxfam. I also joined a group called the Latin American Support Organization. This was the 1980s, so US involvement in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala was pretty nefarious at that point, so we were focused on that. I joined the local Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which is kind of the heart of radicalism in Grinnell, Iowa, which wasn't a very high bar, I have to admit. Radicalism in Oklahoma and radicalism in Iowa really just sort of involves paying attention, more or less. But even back then, the folks who ran Latin American Support Organization and the folks who ran the group Poverty Action Now, they were vegetarians and I think almost all vegans. And they gave me this book, Diet for a Small Planet. And it looks like most people are not on video, but I'm still going to ask the people who are on video, who's familiar with this book? Right, a fair number of people are familiar with the book. This book rocked my world. I grew up in Oklahoma, and somehow I had managed not to think about the fact that farm animals have to eat in order to survive. So it's a fairly simple concept. You have to grow crops to feed them to an animal so that the animal can survive and so that the animal can be raised up and fed. And it takes about, the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat is a chicken. It takes about 9 calories fed to a chicken to get 1 calorie back out, according to the World Resources Institute. It takes about 40 calories fed to a feedlot cow to get 1 calorie back out. So probably everybody on this call is very concerned about food waste. I would guess most of us consider food waste to be a moral issue, to be even a Christian issue. About 40% of food that is grown globally is literally thrown away. And this is in a world where 700 million people now are in nutritional deficit. 700 million people are living in extreme poverty. It looks like it actually just ticked up from COVID-19, north of 100 million more people, but I haven't seen the final stats on that. But in any event, 700 to 850 million people living in nutritional deficit, and we're throwing away massive amounts of food. It's a moral issue for most people. But the thing to realize is the physiology of farm animals means that 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out, 40 calories into a cow to get 1 calorie back out. We're not personally throwing away all of that food, but that's the economic relationship that we're entering into. And that's the economic relationship of meat production. So the former global envoy on food is this guy. His name is Jean Ziegler. And a number of years ago, he called biofuel production a human rights crime. And the reason he called biofuel production a human rights crime is that there was an FAO report indicating that 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat were being turned into biofuels. And the UK government had a report leaked that said that had driven up the price of corn and wheat by 30%. And it was literally causing people to starve to death. The thing that was less remarked upon at the time was that 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat, the exact same FAO report, 756 million metric tons of corn and wheat were fed to chickens and pigs and other farm animals, not even including the 200 million metric tons of corn and wheat. I'm sorry, the 200 million metric tons of soy, about 85% of the global soy crop at the time. So literally 10 times as many crops fed to farm animals. So this is sort of an update on this concept from Diet for a Small Planet, which basically makes the argument that growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals is extraordinarily inefficient, drives up the price of food, literally leads to starvation. So for me, as somebody who took very seriously the Christian concept of who is my neighbor, and my neighbor is everybody, for somebody who took very seriously the idea of if somebody is hungry, you give them food, thinking about this in terms of global economics and what it meant that I was eating animals even as people were starving to death, turned me vegan for human rights reasons, pretty much on the spot back in 1987, so 34 years ago. And the other thing that LePay talks about in the book is just the environmental consequences. And as we all know, fundamental Judeo-Christian concept, actually just religious precept, that the world, the earth, is on loan to us. So in Leviticus 25, God puts it this way: the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, you are but aliens and tenants. So this is a concept of the Sabbath year. This is the concept of the Jubilee year. This is the idea that we should be stewards of creation from the first book of Genesis. And thinking about what I also learned in LePay, so that it's not just the inefficiency of all of the crops fed to animals so that we can eat animals. It's also you're growing all of those crops and you're shipping them to the feed mill, and you're operating the feed mill, and you're shipping the feed to the farm, and you're operating the farm, and you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse. You're operating the slaughterhouse, and you crunch all of those numbers. And what you find is, according again to the UN FAO, a 400-page report called Livestock's Long Shadow, every single environmental issue, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global, the way that we produce meat is one of the top 3 contributors. So sort of all of that put together, that concept with some updated statistics, turned me vegan back in 1987, and really caused me to feel like I couldn't act justly, to quote Micah, and I couldn't incorporate the Matthew 25 principle of feeding the hungry if my diet was literally taking food out of the mouths, not literally, but in the over sort of global economic system, taking food out of the mouths of the global poor. I dropped out of college for about 6 years in 1990, and I dropped out to join the Catholic worker movement. So I ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen, the largest soup kitchen in Washington, D.C. at the time, not associated with the Community for Creative Nonviolence, and then also a homeless shelter that was doing sanctuary work, so providing shelter for families, including families that were undocumented, and helping people who were undocumented to navigate the really tough social services system. Can somebody tell me who this woman is? This is Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. When Pope Francis was in the United States back in 2015, he gave a presentation at a joint session of Congress, and he canonized a saint at the Basilica. And in both cases, he talked about 3 people, 3 Americans for his joint presentation to Congress, and 3 very faithful lay people when he canonized a saint at the Basilica. And Dorothy Day was the one overlap. She founded something called the Catholic Worker Movement. There are about 130 Catholic worker houses now, and they're focused on housing the homeless, visiting the sick and imprisoned, and the various works of mercy. And I ran one for about 6 years in the early 1990s. And I'll say that I didn't just, and they are very much focused on voluntary poverty. They're focused on go, sort of the 2 precepts. Precept 1 is the works of mercy. Precept 2 is go, give all that you have, sell all that you have and give to the poor. So focused on voluntary poverty as well. But I didn't just want to pattern my life on Jesus. I also wanted to look like Jesus. So this is me in the early 1990s. And while I was at the Catholic Worker, trying to live like Jesus and look like Jesus, a book came out. Somebody gave me a book called Christianity and the Rights of Animals by an Anglican theologian, professor of theology at Oxford University named Andrew Lindsay. This is the book. The update on this book is called Animal Theology. And if you have not read Animal Theology, I highly recommend that you do. You don't need to read Christianity and the Rights of Animals. All the principles are in it, but further developed. Lindsay actually wrote this book in 1975, so it actually predates Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. It's even a little bit more radical. So Singer takes the Matthew 25 principle of as you did it to the least of these, so you did it to me, and argues that other animals deserve to be a part of our moral circle of concern. And just like you've probably heard of the preferential option for the poor of liberation theology, Lindsay posits a preferential option for animals as the most vulnerable, and who he challenges us to think of as the least of these. And he basically says, look, other animals are made of flesh and blood and bone, just like human beings are. Other animals have the exact same 5 physiological senses that we do. God designed them with these physiological senses. God designed them to raise their young. God gave them the same physiological response to pain that we have, and that what happens on modern farms and what happens in modern slaughterhouses really makes a mockery of God and should be a serious Christian concern. He takes it back to the Garden of Eden when all was nonviolence, as well as the eschaton vision of the prophets from Isaiah and Micah and others. There is no violence and obviously no slaughterhouses in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 1:29, God gives human beings exclusively plants to eat. It's not until Genesis 9, as a concession to human violence, that people are allowed to eat animals. Genesis 9 is also the chapter that was oftentimes used to justify war, and Lindsay's challenge is, he says, look, Jesus gives us one prayer. It includes the line, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We know that the Garden of Eden, we know that the eschaton vision is nonviolence. This is one area where we can challenge ourselves not to cause harm, where we can challenge ourselves to live the garden vision, where we can challenge ourselves to live the eschaton vision. So the unexamined life is not worth living. What does the Lord require of us but that we act justly? Where is the justice in what happens to animals? And why would we pay people to do things to animals that most of us wouldn't partake in on our own? What does it mean to love mercy? What does it mean to have humility in our relationship with one another, with the world, and with animals? And I found that extraordinarily convincing. I went and worked at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals for 13 years. So I ran the homeless shelter and the soup kitchen for about 6 years. I went back and got my degree, which I was just 3 credits short when I left, but I was afraid I was going to get on this sort of academic track. And I intended to take 1 year off to do the homeless shelter and the soup kitchen work, and it ended up being 6. But then I went to work at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, really basically just inspired by Andrew Lindsay, and feeling like this was a moral atrocity that was largely neglected, underappreciated, and I should focus my time on it. Went to work at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And basically my focus at PETA was trying to convince the world to go vegetarian or vegan. It didn't work very well. So there have been headlines like these every single year since I started at PETA in 1996. And to really just sort of make a longish story short, this is the trajectory. And I joined PETA here, and this is North America, and this is all the rest of the world. And while I remain a really big fan of encouraging people to change their diets and educating people about the harms of industrial animal agriculture, what I came to think is probably true is that diet is about physiology. And Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, has this concept of thinking fast and slow. And I think the reason that any place in the world that has the capacity to be overweight is overweight. And that trajectory never does anything other than goes more and more overweight, in the same way that the trajectory has so far never done anything other than more and more meat. I think that's because where the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is concerned, where physiology is concerned, people simply don't incorporate the external costs of things. They don't have the capacity, for the most part, to lead examined lives. It's physiology. We have been programmed as a human species to, if something is highly caloric and dense in calories, because we are always waiting for the next famine and the next spate of want, we will eat it. And so even as people are aware of the external costs and the harm that they are doing by consuming meat, this is what their trajectory looks like. The other thing that really hit me about this trajectory is you look at, China, Asia, Central and South America, Africa, and what this means is as economies develop, people eat more meat, and it's basically inevitable. So I met the people who founded Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, and one of my good friends going back about 30 years is the proprietor of Crossroads restaurant in Los Angeles. He's also on the board of Impossible Foods and Kite Hill. And the point that they made is that we can biomimic the entire meat experience using plants, and we can cultivate actual animal meat directly from cells. And this allows us to work with human nature rather than against human nature. So this is not veggie burgers for vegetarians. And in the case of cultivated meat, it's actual animal meat. The idea of plant-based meat is, let's actually hire meat scientists and tissue engineers and plant biologists and chemical engineers. Up until Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, the idea of veggie burgers was that they were for vegetarians and flexitarians. The idea of GFI, the idea of Impossible Foods, the idea of Beyond Meat is let's biomimic the entire meat experience, but let's use plants. And for people who absolutely have to have animal meat, we can cultivate that meat directly from cells, and it's actual animal meat. But as you can see, with a fraction of the adverse climate and land use impact. So land use for Impossible and Beyond is roughly 1/20th. CO2 emissions is roughly 90% less. On the cultivated meat front, of all of the plant-based and cultivated products, the one that does the least well is conventional chicken, and even that is a 17% reduction. There is literally no other solution in food and ag that is suggesting they can get a 17% reduction in CO2 emissions. Conventional chicken, cultivated chicken, so growing actual chicken cells directly from an animal, 17%, and almost a fourth the amount of land. And so as a climate solution, it's not just the 17% reduction, but if you repurpose this land for sequestration of carbon, which the IPCC report last week said is going to be absolutely essential, you can get even better carbon metrics. The other thing to point out, the way that we produce meat right now, about 70% of all antibiotics produced globally are fed to farm animals. The UK government said this is a more certain threat to the human race than climate change. The former head of the World Health Organization, Margaret Chan, talks about antibiotic resistance as the end of modern medicine. And we are ushering it in by feeding 70% of all of the antibiotics produced by pharmaceuticals, feeding them to animals. And then one thing just to underline, the UNFAO says 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. We're going to produce 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. And nobody other than alternative proteins is positing a solution that might turn that back. And what that means is 70 to 100% more climate change, 70% to 100% more land, 70 to 100% more antibiotics. The penultimate thing I want to flag is drivers of the next pandemic. In July of 2020, the UN Environment Program listed these as the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one is increased demand for animal protein. The more animals we have, the more likely one of them will have a zoonotic disease. And the second one was industrial animal use, because we're creating all these genetically similar animals with depressed immune systems, and then we're cramming them into factory conditions, which are filthy and crowded, further depressing their immune systems. So we think about something like COVID-19 was not particularly deadly or particularly transmissible, still sent 100 to 150 million people into extreme poverty. So across all of these, climate change, antibiotic resistance, pandemic risk, the people globally who will suffer the most are the least of these, who Jesus calls us to live our lives on behalf of, in my opinion. And then if you incorporate Andrew Lindsay, you're talking about literally tens of billions of animals now and 70 to 100% more. So billions and billions more by 2050, unless we solve the problem. And I would challenge folks to think about what else across this 70 to 100% more meat by 2050, what else you can think of that might actually cause that not to happen. And my hypothesis is that you will not be able to come up with anything. Education is critically important, but I don't think people can be more educated than they are now. And yet people continue to eat massive amounts of meat. So we need to change the meat. And just like this is a phone, even though it doesn't have a cord, and this is a camera, even though it doesn't have analog film, we need to divorce meat production from all of the external costs that I've just been laying out. GFI is a nonprofit organization. We're focused on just that. Everything that we do fits into one of 3 objectives. Our first objective is science. Our second is our global battle cry, which is that government should be supporting alternative proteins. Our third is to influence the for-profit sector. So until GFI, nobody had laid out the technological readiness of alternative proteins. All of the work was happening in the private sector. So it was Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Upside Foods, et cetera. And they have an idea and then they have a company. They have an idea and then they have a company. And nobody had laid out what do we know? What do we know we don't know? Where are the areas of exploration where we don't even know what we don't know? And the plurality of GFI's team members globally are scientists. And we're basically open sourcing the science so that everybody can figure out how we get to products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less. It's really, we think, the way that this problem is solved. And this is the only food and ag solution that analogizes to renewable energy and electric vehicles. In both cases, renewable energy and electric vehicles, the idea is to just, we're not going to convince the world to ride a bike and walk. We're not going to convince the world to consume less energy. But what we can do is make energy production and driving significantly less harmful. Same thing here with meat. Our global battle cry is to convince governments to support alternative proteins. We're meeting with a lot of success in all of the 6 areas of the world where we operate. And basically we say, look, governments support renewable energy. They support electrification of transport. They support global drug development. For the same reason that governments support these other things, government should also be supporting alternative proteins. The reason, if you go to our website, we're focused predominantly on climate, environment, and global health, is that governments will spend money on things to meet their Paris obligations, to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. Governments will spend money to try to keep antibiotics working. Governments will spend money mitigating pandemic risk, and alternative proteins do all those things. So that's our focus in our conversations with government. And we do have lobbyists in all of those 6 areas of the world. And then the third one is influencing the for-profit sector to prioritize alternative proteins. And we work with people all the way from pre-entrepreneur, figuring out what they want to do, all the way up to the really big food and meat companies, because we're trying to turn what we're doing into transformation rather than disruption. If you go to gfi.org, you can find out more about all of this. We have monthly webinars, the science of alt proteins. We have monthly webinars, the business of alt proteins, all kinds of fact sheets and other information. So my hypothesis is that alternative proteins is an excellent cause area for people who, I guess it's kind of an amalgam cause area, but for folks who recognize climate change, as a borderline existential risk, who are concerned about naturally occurring pandemics, who are concerned about the end of modern medicine, or are concerned about animals. Alternative proteins is a really good place to focus your time. In terms of career, basically the same argument. And my main challenge with regard to career, though, is to say, I really love Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, where he talks about challenges people to pray without ceasing. I talk a lot at GFI about vocational self-actualization, which I think is similar to Paul's concept of praying without ceasing. And it basically, it's back to the quote from Micah as well: acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly. Doing something that is focused on making the world a better place, where you actually think about how important is the issue, how tractable is the issue, how neglected is the issue, and that's what you focus on with your career. I think one of the things I love about Catholicism is daily mass and sort of the daily focus on reminding yourself of what it means to be a person of faith. If you can align your career with those concepts, I think that is truly beautiful. Giving, I won't say a lot about giving, other than that I do, alternative proteins, I think is a very worthy way to put a very worthy place to put some of your philanthropic capital as well. Happy to chat with anybody who wants to chat about that. And I will just close by reminding us of what it means to live a faithful life. I think this is true regardless of one's faith. This transcends religions, but I get a lot of meaning from it as a Catholic. So we should be thinking about, and I think it's not always intuitive and most people don't do it, but we should be thinking about how can we maximize our focus on justice and mercy and humility, which I think overlaps super, super well with the fundamental EA concepts of how impactful, neglected, and tractable is what it is that I'm going to be focusing on. And I will end there and be delighted to have whatever conversation JD would like to lead us through.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bruce. Here's a digital clap for Bruce. Everyone, if you could join me in thanking him for that wonderful talk. A lot of depth there, a lot of denseness. And I want to just jump into that. Just one last reminder, we do have a Slido with some Q&A that many of you have already contributed to. Thank you for that. You can also upvote the best questions so far. I have a few lined up, Bruce, here. So I'd love to just kick it off with that, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I love what you were saying at the end there about maximizing justice and humility and the alignment with EA there. And also from First Thessalonians about the call to constantly be praying. One of these top voted questions has to do with that. What practices do you invest in to keep your faith flourishing while in a leadership position in a very secular sector, and particularly the EO ecosystem as well, right? Which is maybe over 80% non-Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I really do. So Dorothy Day, again, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who was also a journalist, she sort of came into, she founded the Catholic Worker in the early 30s, and she talked about this concept of people who are communists. She was talking about in particular who appear to be Christians, by the way, are Catholics by the way they live their lives, and people who she sees at Mass who appear to be atheists by the way they live their lives. I take a lot from, again, the Matthew 25. Like, Jesus doesn't tell us that saying I am a Christian is what makes you Christian. Jesus says I am making life choices on behalf of the least of these is what makes you a Christian. Gandhi similarly basically said, if you're going to be a Christian, be a good Christian. If you're going to be a Hindu, be a good Hindu, and so on. So I think the fact, I mean, I really do feel like EA is a good home for the concept of leading a life that does the most good for the least of these. That really is, I mean, it's fascinating. Obviously, some of the EA analysis gets sort of heady and can be probably challenging for a lot of people who are Christians, but it doesn't require sort of turning my head and squinting to try to find the alignment. I think the alignment's pretty good. I do have a meditation practice, and I do go to mass, although when I was running Catholic Worker, I went to mass almost every day. Now I'm lucky if I go once a week, but I do find it grounding and centering. And I do think a meditation practice where I will oftentimes do Jesus-focused meditations, I find grounding and useful.
You've written about that in some blogs, or it's been written about you elsewhere on the internet. Are there any particular meditation practices or prayers in the Christian tradition that you'd be happy to share? Any specific names of any that have been particularly moving for you?
I mean, I like the Jesus prayer. I like the rosary. I mean, the thing that I do more than anything else is just mindfulness centering. If I do use one word to focus on, it will oftentimes just be Jesus, which I really like. I did a silent retreat where they challenged us to do, anyway, 2-minute meditations, 2-minute silence. And at GFI, we start every leadership team meeting and every all staff meeting with 2 minutes of mindfulness breathing. And I usually do a Thich Nhat Hanh centering as the sort of opening for those 2 minutes. But I will oftentimes do the Jesus prayer personally, or just center on the word Jesus, which I like. And for me, at least, it's a challenge back to Matthew 25. And also a challenge to go sell all that you have and give to the poor, which I think is it's this sort of Peter Singer concept, right? That we should give until it hurts. And, Peter says we don't need to actually give away everything because that's not sustainable, but that would be the sort of rationalist ideal. And it's sort of fascinating that the rationalist ideal would overlap so completely with, one of the things that Jesus said.
Well, it's no surprise. I think many on this call would say it's not a Peter Singer thing. It's really a Jesus thing. And Peter Singer found this aspect of Jesus that we also cherish very much. Thank you for that. The top voted question is, how should we trade off devoting limited resources to animal versus human suffering? Of course, in some cases, they're complementary, right? But they often force us to choose. I know GFI talks about helping meet the needs of the global poor and alleviating animal welfare, or improving animal welfare, kind of both and, right? But don't you have to make a trade-off? For instance, if you have a certain amount of money to donate, and you have one that helps animals more and one that helps people more, how do you do that? Do you have any tips or any insight into that?
Well, I mean, I think this is I think that's a sort of quintessentially Christian question and quintessentially EA question. And I like JD what you said, that Peter's borrowing from Peter Singer's borrowing from Jesus. That's really quite wonderful. But I think he might contest that. Yeah, I'm not sure I have I mean, I will say I taught in inner city Baltimore through Teach for America for a couple of years. And while I was doing that, anytime I would tell people what I was doing, they would be incredibly laudatory. And it's sort of like somebody who's in the military. If you say you're a teacher, people are just like, wow, thank you. Oh, in inner city Baltimore, thank you. And similarly, when I was running the homeless shelter in the soup kitchen for 6 years, people were incredibly grateful. And nobody ever said, why are you doing that? Why aren't you in banking? Whereas if you're doing animal rights or animal protection, people will ask, why are you doing animal rights? Why are you doing especially animal rights, but probably also animal protection? And there's this sort of bizarre, we need to solve all of the human problems first before we think about animal problems. And for me, the reason I went to PETA after running the homeless shelter and soup kitchen for so long was quite literally the fact that people would ask, why would you want to do animal protection? I think it knocks neglectedness out of the park, metaphorically speaking. And I think the fact that the vast majority of people don't give to animal causes would point toward, both from a Christian standpoint when you're thinking about the least of these, and also from an EA standpoint when you're thinking about neglectedness. If you look at where philanthropic resources go if you look at what people are dedicating their careers to, one disease gets more money, cancer or heart disease, probably also diabetes gets more philanthropic resources, and also has more people dedicating their career to it than everything animal related put together. And so to me, for somebody who is wanting to love mercy and have humility about how we think about the world, we will all as human beings care more about human suffering viscerally. And I think the challenge is to lead an examined life. The challenge is to have some humility around those natural predilections, and to challenge ourselves to think, is the suffering, how much less important is the suffering of a chicken than the suffering of a human being, where they both feel pain in the same way, and they were both designed by God with the wants and needs and desires that they had. So for me, at least, I'm gonna dodge the question a little bit, but offer sort of those reflections as things for people to be thinking about from either an EA vantage or from a Christian vantage.
Thank you for that. I think that really carries the EA ethos. It's something we have to be thinking about as Christians. And just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about it. A lot of Christians have thought about this. And one question points to that. They cite a passage in Luke where Jesus was given a boiled piece of fish, and he took it and he ate it before his disciples. This is, after his resurrection, and he's showing his humanity, of course. Jesus ate meat and did not sin. So I can thus eat meat, right? That's what the questioner asks. So what do you say to that? And that's more of a criticism in general, perhaps, or challenge in general, perhaps, for finding a biblical basis for vegetarianism. Do you have any quick responses to that?
Well, I mean, I think you definitely hit upon the fact. I think that Jesus eats fish is in just Luke. I don't think it's in the other three gospels. I don't remember for sure, but anybody who does not have a literal interpretation of scriptures will find that was to prove that Jesus had actually come back in the body, and it's a story of Jesus showing his corporealness by eating. But more fundamentally, if you look at, I think you look again at the Garden of Eden, you look again at the eschaton visions, you think about nonviolence writ large, you think about justice, mercy, and humility, justice and mercy in particular, and you look at if that justifies eating fish, I would just challenge people, maybe it justifies going to a lake, putting a hook in, pulling a fish out. If you think about that from the fish's perspective, you won't find a lot of justice or mercy there. But if you investigate what factory trawling looks like or aquaculture looks like, it really does deny God by denying God's animals everything that they were designed to be and to do. At the end of the day, I moved from day to day trying to convince people to go vegetarian and vegan to GFI because I think people will come up with rationalizations to continue to eat meat, as well as the fact that most of that 70 to 100%, almost all of it, increased meat consumption by 2050 is going to happen outside developed economies where we even have the capacity to have that conversation with people. So I think let's make that fish. Let's give people that exact fish consumption experience, but let's do it with plants, or let's give them the exact same product, but without the dioxins and the mercury and the heavy metal contamination by cultivating actual fish cells and producing that directly. But yeah, I mean, the human brain has a lot of capacity for rationalization, but I think at the end of the day, we should not be engaging in processes where we look at them and there are clear morally problematic aspects to them, unless we absolutely have to, and we don't have to.
So I'd love to ask some more questions. I want to be conscious of your time. I'd love to get at least 2 more in before you go. Do you have another 5 minutes to field 1 or 2 more?
Yeah, of course. Delighted.
Thanks so much. So this one's about GFI. Your team has gone from 3 people about 6 years ago to over 140 now. What's that been like? Do you have any words of advice for people who would maybe want to start up a charity or considering that path?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a basically healthy degree of growth. There's certainly been some lessons learned. There are things I would do differently. Um, I'm happy to set a one-on-one with anybody who's thinking of starting an organization. I take very seriously the sort of four quadrants concept of time management from Stephen Covey. And quadrant two is things that are important, but that might not, be super urgent. And one of the things that I think that I try to prioritize is having conversations with people about their career path and having conversations with anybody who's starting anything. So I can try to be as useful to them as possible. Like those conversations could, change the trajectory of that organization or change the trajectory of that person. So those feel incredibly sort of highly important, even if they don't seem super urgent. So happy to have a conversation with anybody who's thinking in that direction. I will say showing your work. So I started working on GFI in September 2015. We started hiring staff in June of the next year. And I spent a lot of time just having conversations with people to figure out what GFI should be and how it should focus. So I would say that is definitely something that we got right. I also produced monthly reports, sort of spelling out everything that I was doing and then everything that GFI is doing. We still do that. So anybody who wants to get those can go to gfi.org/newsletters, and you will get our monthly reports every month. I think doing that right. One thing I would probably do differently if I could go back in time. I definitely had a sort of my comfort level with chaos is super high. I think once GFI got north of like 25 or 30 people, I was sort of assuming everybody else's comfort level with chaos was the same as mine, and that wasn't true. So I think making sure that we got the structures in place, and we've had them for a couple of years now, but there was a little bit of pain there for a little while when we didn't have all the sort of foundations in place, and I just sort of continued pushing us to hire. So I would encourage people to not do that, but lots of other lessons, but those are a few.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I'm encouraged by all of this. What I'm hearing, I would like to just give everyone one last opportunity to field a question. Just a reminder, you're free to ask any question, and each is cause neutral. Feel free to ask a zesty question that might be especially challenging for Bruce. I'm happy to field it. But I'm looking here at the Slido for some more. One quick one. If land use and calorie inputs for Beyond an Impossible meat is so much less, like you hinted at in your presentation, why is it still more expensive than meat products?
I love that question so much. And the thing is, we're not making an app. So GFI, maybe 4 or 5 months ago, produced a report. It's called production volume modeling. So if you Google GFI production volume modeling, you'll see that there's not enough coconut oil to get us even to 6% plant-based meat by 2030. So there is still a supply and demand issue with the actual raw ingredients into the products. So creating the pea protein isolate, creating the coconut oil. So the short answer is economies of scale, but it's a lot more complex than that when you actually need to sort of create the lead time for the farmers to grow the peas and the manufacturing plants to process the peas or the soy or whatever into isolates and to create the coconut oil or whatever you're going to add. So it will all work out as they scale up. But our prediction is taste the same or better and cost the same or less. Even on the plant-based side, even for burgers, is probably 2 or 3 years off. For cultivated, it's going to be a little bit further. So it definitely warrants the government support that we're working very hard to get it.
Good answer. Thank you for that. One last question from me. I'm very curious. Let's say somebody is keen to support animal welfare with their donations, and they feel called to do that, and they don't give to GFI. Are there any other orgs that you would recommend that are highly effective in this space, particularly for charitable donations?
Yeah, I mean, my wife and I give to the the Wild Animal Initiative. We give to Mercy for Animals, Animal Equality, the Humane League. Those are a few. I'm sure I'm leaving out lots of wonderful charities. Very, very excited about the fascinating work that the Wild Animal Initiative is doing. I do think we need to change the zeitgeist. My wife works at PETA, and I'm a fan of PETA's work. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage people I mean, different organizations have sort of different focuses and priorities, but there are a lot of great animal protection organizations that I think are worthy of support.
Solid. Thank you so much, Bruce. If people want to reach out to you and encourage you or support you in any way, what are the best ways for them to do those things?
Well, I would encourage, I mean, I'll just do another plug for gfi.org/newsletters. So that's how you can keep up to date on everything happening on alternative proteins, as well as GFI. On Twitter, GFI is Good Food Inst. I am Bruce G. Friedrich on Twitter. Folks are welcome to email me. Because I've been traveling for like the last 11 days, I'm gonna be slow to reply for a little bit, but I get back to people 100% of the time, but right now is a little rough. My email address is brucef@gfi.org. And I will say we have a monthly Business of Alt Protein webinar, a monthly Science of Alt Protein seminar. We have a massive open online course for people who want to dive in and learn more about alternative proteins. We have a community, gfi.org/community. So a whole host of ways to get involved.
Awesome. Well, I wish you good travels with all the traveling you're doing in the coming months. I hope you catch a breath. It's quite impressive all that you pack in with one life and one career. So thank you for the last hour, and we'll certainly be thinking of and praying for you in your mission. So thank you, Bruce.
Delighted to be here. Thank you very much to all of you, and thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it and appreciate it, and appreciate everything that you all are doing to make the world a more merciful and just place.